This is the problem with doing it not live. You can't do it. Right, okay.
Take your time, it's all good.
Take two. Good evening. I'm Jane Wilkinson, the owner and managing director of New Forest Escapes. We are the largest local independent agency in the New Forest, having grown organically since 2014 when we were founded. Now, 11 years later, we are proud to represent over 55 owners looking after their properties, some fully managed and others just for the sales and marketing aspect. We've grown by focusing on high quality customer care for both our owners and our guests. And that's why we're bringing you this webinar today, as part of our ethos to help our New Forest Escapes owners, but also to support other owners in this sector. We felt that some clear guidance on the changing landscape of fire safety for furnished holiday lets, or FHLs as we call them, would really be beneficial after the changes made back in September 2023. So thank you for joining us this evening. We have with us Greg and Leo from Staysafe Compliance, specialists in this area with years of experience between them. So I'll hand you over to them, then we'll give you a quick recap on the current holiday let market, followed by a Q&A session before we close up. The webinar is being recorded and will be sent to all of you, so don't worry if you miss parts. And if you've got any questions for at the end, please write them in the box, so at the bottom of your screen, so we can ask Leo and Greg. So over to you.
Fab. Thank you, Jane. I'll just try to show my screen. Excellent. Can you see it okay, guys?
Yeah, that's fine.
Fab. Okay, so thank you for tuning in, everybody, and hopefully you'll find the next 30 minutes insightful. We'll try and keep it as interesting as possible. It is fire safety, but we'll try and keep it as interesting as possible. So Greg and I have worked for a number of years actually in the holiday let industry. So it's an industry that we're passionate about outside of fire safety, but we're really pleased to be able to bring in our expertise into the industry as well. So Greg has an extensive background in long lettings and obviously short-term lettings as well. And I'm also, alongside being a director for Staysafe, I'm also the fire officer for St Paul's Cathedral in London. So yeah, we work with a number of different types of buildings, all the way from holiday lets through to heritage buildings and a little bit in between as well. So I suppose I just wanted to start today by talking a bit about the background behind fire safety and the legislation that's in place. And then as we go through the presentation, I'll start to narrow in on some areas that are probably more relevant and areas that you will understand in a lot more detail. But I think it's probably important to start with the regulatory reform fire safety order. That's I suppose the big piece of legislation which sets the standards for fire safety in all but domestic buildings across the UK. And this piece of legislation is enforced by local authorities. So depending on where you are in the country, whatever your local fire and rescue services, they will be the enforcing authority most of the time. So I suppose the first thing to mention with that piece of legislation is it's can be quite a generic and vague in some respects piece of legislation. So if we were to simply hand you the legislation to read, not only would it be very long, but it's also it's difficult to know how to apply that to your property. And particularly over the last few years, and as a result of a number of high profile fire events that have happened in our country, but also internationally, there's been a lot more focus on fire safety. And in 2022, there was an act called the Building Safety Act, which was another piece of legislation that was produced. And there's two main parts of this act that I think are really quite pertinent to today's call. I think the first one is Article 50, which is essentially says that the Secretary of State, the government, have to produce codes of practice or guidance to ensure that people in different building types can interpret the legislation. So they made that law that the government had to do that, and from that came a piece of guidance called the Small Paying Accommodation Guide, which is appropriate for most short-term holiday let owners. The second piece of that Building Safety Act, which I think is really important, is Section 156, and essentially what that piece of the legislation says is that if you don't follow that guidance that has been legislated for, then you could be in breach of the fire safety order. So I think it's really important that we understand those two pieces of the Building Safety Act, because what they effectively do is they say, right, the government have to provide guidance documents so that people can interpret the legislation. But secondly, they say you really got to follow that guidance, because if you don't, then you could be in breach of the fire safety order. So, talking of codes of practice, so we've got legislation, then we've got codes of practice, which allow us to interpret that legislation. There are two main guides, and I'd imagine that these capture most short-term holiday let owners. One of them is called the Small Paying Guest Accommodation Guide, which you can see a little bit, an image on the right-hand side of the screen, and then the other is the Sleeping Accommodation Guide. And depending on the kind of the size and the layout of your property will fall into one of these pieces of guidance. So, for example, if you've got a property that either sleeps more than 10 people, that is set over 3 floors or more, or has an open plan downstairs, then it would fall into the Sleeping Accommodation Guide. Whereas if it's smaller, if it's 2 stories, if it's not got an open plan downstairs, or if it sleeps less than 10 people, then it will likely fall into the Small Paying Guest Accommodation Guide. And I think it's really important to understand that, because when we go around as fire risk assessors, we're trying to apply the legislation, and depending on the property type, we will apply one type of guidance as opposed to the other. And there are some subtle differences in between the two. I suppose in a nutshell, the Small Paying Guest Accommodation Guide is designed more for smaller properties. It's probably a little bit more forgiving, whereas the Sleeping Accommodation Guide holds a slightly higher standard of fire safety. And as we've said before, Greg and I get this question a lot as we go around the country. We say, well, it's, we hear people say, well, it's just guidance. Do we need to follow it? And I think I just reiterate that point in the previous slide. Because of that Section 156 of the Building Safety Act, it's really important that people don't just take this guidance as guidance, but it's actually it's a way of interpreting that piece of legislation. So it's really important that we follow the guidance where we can. So in terms of today, and again, I will try and keep it as interesting, succinct and informative as possible, but the way we set out this presentation is we're going to go through a couple of kind of key areas that we think are common questions, common areas that we get asked about all the time. And then I've got another slide towards the end where we go through a number of different items that, again, just common observations that Greg and I see as we go around the country. And if you've got any questions, if you're sat watching this and you're thinking of questions, hopefully we'll cover some of these in the slides that are coming. But if we don't, for whatever reason, then do feel free to get in touch with us. We'll pop our details on the screen at the end, or of course you can get in touch with the New Forest team, and they can put you in touch with us as well. So I just want to start with detection. So detection is obviously super important, because it's our way in the fire world of identifying whether there's been a fire. And the first thing I want to say is the premises, the intended use of the premises, is super important when we're talking about detection. And what I mean by this is, if you've got a kind of a standard 3-bed house with a single garage detached, and you live in it with your kids, then there's a certain minimum level of fire safety you will need in that property, and that'll typically be determined by the building regulations that were in place at the time of the construction of the building. So, but if you wanted to use that same house and you wanted to use it as a holiday let, suddenly the intended use of the premises is different. So it's really important that we follow the guidance for whatever's appropriate for that property. So it would either be the Small Paying Accommodation Guide or the Sleeping Accommodation Guide, depending on the layout. So I think it's a really important point to make. And if you didn't know already, if you've got exactly the same property, but it's used for 2 different things, then 2 different types of guidance will apply to those 2 situations. So that's why you might find, the house that you live in at home might have slightly different requirements to a holiday let. And I suppose the three main areas of detection when we're talking about fire alarm systems, first of all, both guidance, whether it's the sleep and accommodation guidance or it's the small paying guest accommodation guidance, both suggest that your system is mains powered. And the reason that it is it's just to reduce the chances of a failure happening as a result of batteries dying. So it's really important that your detection is wired in. That's the recommendation now. Linked is really important. So if you've got a number of different rooms in your house, a kitchen, 3 bedrooms, it's important that if there's a fire that starts in one room, that everybody in the property is aware of that fire starting. So when your detectors and sounders are linked, it means that you've got early warning and guests have the best chance of getting out safely and quickly. And then the third thing is coverage. So ultimately, it's all well and good if you have a link system. It could be mains powered as well. But if you've not got coverage in key areas, so you don't have a detector, for example, in your kitchen or a high risk room, something like a boiler room or a utility room area, then it could mean that a fire starts, but a detector wouldn't pick it up quickly, and therefore it potentially increases the risk of the escape for guests. So those three aspects are really important. In our world, we talk about them in terms of grades. So effectively, you've got grade A all the way down to grade F. What the grade is in an alarm system is it's the level of protection and reliability you get. So typically in a commercial building, something like a hotel, you would see a grade A system, and you'd have a panel and you'd have detectors and separated sounders all around the building. But in a domestic setting like a house or even a holiday let, you typically wouldn't see grade A's to C, you'd see grades D, E or F. And what we're looking for, what the guidance is looking for in holiday lets is a grade D system. So this is a mains powered system that's wired in, that has a battery backup. And a lot of the systems that you can get nowadays, the batteries last for the lifespan of the smoke alarm itself or the heat alarm. So it means that once you've installed it, you don't have to really worry about it in terms of servicing. All you need to do is test it regularly. So that's what the grades mean, and then you might see some documents that have coverage on them. So things like LD1, LD2, LD3. All that means is it means how many rooms that the detectors are in. So in holiday lets in 2025, the guidance is really looking for a grade D system with LD1 coverage, which is effectively coverage in pretty much every room except for your bathrooms and your toilets and that kind of thing. Testing is really important in domestic systems, so we'll come on to it a little bit later, but just making sure if you do have systems that you're pushing the button to test them regularly, just to make sure that they work. Obviously, it's all well and good having a system, but if it's not tested and doesn't work, then it's obviously not particularly useful in the event of a fire. So just making sure that we are testing the systems regularly and we're recording that as well. And probably the best way of doing this in the holiday let setting would be by your changeover person, whether that's a cleaner or a house manager that does those changeovers for you. If you can't do that for whatever reason, then something like a monthly test would be at least showing that you're testing your system regularly. So that's detection. And
Leo,
through the means of escape, aren't you?
Yeah, so means of escape. So really, I mean, it does say what it means, what it says on the tin. But what we decided to do was really lift these key messages directly from the guidance. This is exactly as it's stated. This is what the Home Office would like us to see when we go around as fire risk assessors. And some of this might seem obvious, but it's something that you really should, make sure that you think about. Emergency routes and exits leading directly as possible to a place of safety. So this isn't just, the final door as you're leaving the property. It's actually getting from, for instance, a bedroom all the way to those doors to leave. And, that should just be very easy for people. And The next one there is, keeping them clear of obstructions that may hinder people doing that. It's all very nice, and we're not saying that you have to have completely clear, bare properties, but people will have, want to have plants and things like this, and ornaments and things like that, and you should just be aware, I suppose, that escape routes are kept clear of obstructions that may hinder an escape route. And then that would also be the same for when you actually do open that door. You can't have an escape route, or we certainly wouldn't want to see a door opening where there's bins up against it and things like that. I know sometimes that's tricky in holiday letting to try and work out where you can keep all these things, but it's something that you really should consider. And just make sure that people can use them safely and easily. And the really big one on here as well, which we're so keen on, and as are both of the guides, is that these final exit doors should be easy to unlock and must not need a key to open them from the inside. This is something that changed over the years. I'm sure some of you may just have keys that would be required to unlock. Equally, there's some break glass boxes that we see quite a lot of the time where people will have that key in that box, and that's probably years ago considered, well, that's okay in the event of a fire, then people can break that and use the key. But really, that if you think about it, hopefully all of us on this call would never actually have to go through that. But if a property is filled with smoke, if it's the middle of the night, it's quite a stressful situation, of course, probably one of the most stressful situations you'll have. And, for people, and we'll come on to unfamiliar surroundings in a minute, but to be able to work out what it is they're trying to achieve here and how they achieve and get out of the property safely, it's tricky at times. And so these literally you should be able to walk up to a door and open it with your hand and leave very easily. And then also, which again we'll talk about in a bit, but we'd like to see people detailing what is the escape route, where are the exit doors, and that should be left in a property for guests to read. Now, sometimes they don't read them, but I think what we need to do is give people all of the available information that we can to enable people to get out safely, should the situation arise, really. And so, yeah, I touched on that one there, and I think it is really, really important to give people as much information as they possibly can. So any occupants in your building, in your property, because as I'm sure we probably all has experienced at some point in our lives, if you're staying in a hotel or you're staying, even with friends or wherever you may be, if you do wake up in the middle of the night for some reason, and we're talking about a fire situation here, most of the time you may think that you're in your own house and you are just not in that instant thinking, oh no, I'm actually in this holiday home. So just to give people, again, just a nudge, encourage people to be actually reading some information on how they can familiarize themselves with a building that they may have only just got into, minutes or hours earlier. And very often these welcome folders these days are one of the only forms of communication between the owner of the property or the managing agent, such as New Forest Escapes, to the guest. You might not meet them there, might be a lockbox. So, to be able to give as much detailed information as possible is very useful. And again, digital is fab. If we can do digital as well as physical, it doesn't, it's obviously just crossing off all the boxes if you can. But, either way, we would definitely like to see some sort of physical welcome folder in a property. And if we could have a digital one as well, that would be the gold standard, really. And then having some sort of fire safety brief, we've got it on the right hand side of the slide there, just to give people just some reminders on how to act in a property that's not going to cause unnecessary risks, really, in terms of smoking and being careful with wood burners, not using candles, shutting doors as well in the evening, very, very important, because that would limit the spread of smoke and fire. And then, should this be needed, an emergency action plan. So, all of the things that we sort of spoke about earlier, just being able to, how do we get out? Where do we get out? Where do we assemble? What do we do? Wait for the fire service before we go back in. All these sorts of things. It's really important just to remind people, really.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth mentioning, if you do have Greg and I coming out to do a fire risk assessment, then we include a fire safety brief and an emergency action plan at the back of our reports as well. We actually didn't at first, but I think after seeing lots of properties and seeing lots of different types of standards of fire safety brief, I think it just made sense for us to write these for the properties that we're in. But we can send across electronic copies as well. So if owners wanted to add a bit more detail in, if they've got unique aspects of their property that they want to let people know about, then that's absolutely fine. But yeah, these are really key, and often, particularly in, I suppose, in 2025, a lot of businesses are using digital welcome folders, which are fantastic, and we definitely support those. But typically, they go to the lead booker of the party that's staying in the property. So again, just another reason to have that physical welcome folder there if you can as well. So as promised, here are some other common observations that we see as we're traveling around. And I'd say the first one is emergency lighting. Now, that compared to the fire extinguisher, that emergency lighting torch looks really big. They're not actually that big in real life. They're quite small. But emergency lighting, something that if you're in a commercial space, you'll typically have fixed emergency lighting on the walls or the ceiling. And the purpose of emergency lighting is if there's a mains power failure, the emergency lighting will light up and it'll give approximately 3 hours, at least 3 hours worth of light, so that people can see and make their way to an exit. Obviously, when it comes to a holiday let, these buildings are typically a lot smaller than those commercial buildings, so there's no requirement to have fixed emergency lighting in place. But you can get these torches. They're very simple. They plug into your sockets. They're about 15 to 20 pounds each. You might be able to find somebody for even less than that. And as soon as your mains power cuts, they light up. Or people want to grab them, they light up as well. And they just make it easy for people to escape. I think, as Greg said before, the circumstances, even if you've been at a holiday home for 3 or 4 days, if you're woken up by an alarm in the middle of the night, you suddenly might forget where you are. So again, another reason to have that emergency lighting provision in place. We would recommend that you at least have it in every sleeping room, but you might want to add it into some common areas as well. I think the second common observation that we see is maintenance, maintenance of both electrical, fixed and portable electrical installations, but also heating appliances, whether that's gas, oil, or whatever it might be. This typically tends to be an action point on a lot of our risk assessments that we do, and I think in a lot of cases it might just be a case of planning and owners perhaps forgetting that their PAT testing hasn't been done, or with an EICR lasting for 5 years, you might not have set a reminder, or it might have been on an old phone or something. So it's probably just a good time after this to go and have a look at what you've got in place already. But in terms of electrical items, we recommend an EICR, which is essentially a certificate which will tell us that your fixed electrical installations are all safe and all working. Portable appliance testing is the same thing, but for your portable equipment, so things like hair dryers and toasters and that kind of thing. And then with your heating appliances, if you've got gas in your property, it's actually a legal requirement to have a gas safety certificate. So that's a higher priority item. And the same if you have oil. If you have oil heating, we would need an oil safety certificate as well. Firefighting appliances, these are, I suppose, I think there's a lot of confusion around whether you should have them in your properties. Now, the guidance recommends that people have them, but I suppose with any environment, if you've got fire extinguishers, it's not mandatory that they're used in the event of a fire. We would always say in any building, the main focus is you getting out of the property and getting out safely. But saying that, they are homes, they are properties, and if it's a small fire that can be tackled and someone feels capable of doing so, then they can and should use a fire extinguisher. There has been some changes to the advice around powder. So we see a lot actually of powder-based extinguishers in kitchens, and the recommendation actually says that you shouldn't have them in small spaces. The reason being is when you discharge the powder inside them, it becomes very difficult to see. It can disorientate people, and secondly, it's quite a toxic discharge inside them. So again, if you're breathing in toxic fumes, it's just not great. So there's a new piece of technology called FireXO, which is which tackles both those problems. So it doesn't disorientate people, and it's less toxic. And that's what we recommend when we're going into most properties, having a little FireXO extinguisher in your kitchen. We'd always recommend it's mounted because, again, people move them around. So if it's mounted, they're less likely to move them around, and also a fire blanket. And again, I appreciate it's a cost for owners. It's another cost, and it's not a sexy cost. But I suppose what we always say is, if there is a small fire and someone can use a fire extinguisher, it might save just a lot more hassle, a lot more cost if the fire starts to spread throughout the property. So it's more from a, try and protect your property, and we definitely recommend having those in. And just for the record, we don't get any commission from FireXO. It's just a product that we that we would recommend. Travel distances. So when I say travel distances, what I mean is, if there's an alarm activation, how far does somebody have to travel until they get to a place of total safety? And depending on the type of building, what it's used for, there's different travel distances that are recommended in the guidance. So with sleeping accommodation, it's a higher risk than most types of property. And generally, if it's a pretty standard house that's built relatively recently, then it will have good travel distances, because the building regulations stipulate that the travel distance has to be a certain amount. So if it's a property built this year, for example, that will already be taken care of when it was signed off by building control. I think one of the challenges that we see is particularly in older properties, or properties that have changed use. So if you've got a heritage property, a grade 2 property, or a grade 1 property even, that wasn't designed to be a holiday let, we might see some issues with travel distances. And if we've got properties that are heritage, for example, we're not necessarily going to recommend that you smash through the wall and put an external staircase there for people to escape. But what it does mean is it heightens the need for all of the other fire safety provision in the property. So it just means that, okay, we've got a risk here. It takes longer for somebody to get out than is ideal. So we need to make sure we've got strong detection. We might need to look at compartmentation and try and make sure that we compartment the fire as best we can to allow people to escape. So that's what we mean when we say travel distance. It's not something, I wouldn't say it's a common thing that we see, but it's just something to be aware of if you do have a property that's a little bit older, or it's changed purpose for whatever reason. Garden pods, I think certainly post COVID, these are pretty common. I live in London, and I think most of the houses down my street have some kind of garden pod where people work from. So it's again, these should be. It depends on how far they are from the property, but they should certainly be treated as part of the property. So typically, unless you're in a giant field, that they're relatively close to the property, and you'll need to escape past the property. So it does depend on the situation, but what we generally say with garden pods is try and make sure that you've got protection in there, so that if you are in there and there's a fire in the main property, you will be alerted and you'll be able to escape safely. And this is, I suppose, even more important if those garden pods, or shepherd's huts in the gardens, are being used as sleeping accommodation, because that's when people, they're not going to hear a fire. So the first time they'll get alerted is if the alarm goes off. So we certainly recommend extending link detection into those garden pods. Inner rooms, so we're getting a bit technical now. I did say I would try and keep it interesting. So inner rooms is basically where you have to go through a room to get to your escape route. So you might have like a bedroom within a bedroom. These are a bit of a red flag in our world of fire safety. And the important thing when you have what's called an inner room condition is that the access room between the inner room and the escape route has detection in it. And that detection can be heard as a sounder or potentially another detector in the inner room. There was a property in Suffolk actually just a few months ago that I did that had a kind of a children's room off a main bedroom, and it had a door to it. So it's important that if you've got children sleeping in that room, that if there's a fire in the access room, then they're aware of that, because otherwise they could be trapped in that inner room. So that's why we make a special effort to make sure that if we've got inner rooms, then people are aware if there is a fire starting and they can escape safely. Checks and records. So again, we spoke a little bit earlier about detection and emergency lighting. So these are a couple of things that are obviously really important in the event of a fire. We don't have to service domestic fire alarms like you do with a commercial one, so they don't require 6 monthly servicing. But what we should be doing is checking them regularly. So what we would say as a holiday let owner is, if you've got a cleaner going in, they can check that the emergency lighting torches work. They can hold the sounder on one of the detectors, and if it's linked, they all should sound, and then they can sign off to say I've checked them, they work, and everything's good to go. So it's just keeping checks and records is really important. Again, it paints you as a diligent owner, and if the worst was to happen, if you can say that you're keeping all of your electrical appliances maintained, if you can show that you've got really good provision in your house, if you can show that you've got checks and records, if you show that you've got a fire risk assessment, then it minimizes the chances of you having an issue in a courtroom a little bit later on. And that's obviously an important thing to think about as well. And the final one is fire doors. So fire doors are, again, there's quite a lot of conflicting information around fire doors that we tend to read and we hear about. A lot of it depends on the type of property that you have, but when you've got, particularly in larger properties or properties where you've got quite extensive escape routes, it's important that those escape routes are protected. So again, in newer properties, it's not so much of an issue. As part of building control, there'll generally be good fire door provision in place. Where we tend to see this as an issue is in older properties that have sometimes those really thin, flimsy doors. So we recommend it. They don't necessarily have to be third-party accredited fire doors, but we do recommend that doors are of solid construction, they fit well in the frame. They're not necessarily required to have intumescent strips and seals and things like that. But it's important to consider fire doors if you've got really kind of thin doors that are leading onto escape routes. And again, that's in some of the latest guidance that came out this year. The wording was adapted slightly on fire doors, so there's certainly a bit of a focus around that area. So, key messages from us. I think the first one will be to use the guidance. Really follow the guidance if you can. It's there to help you interpret the legislation, and not all of it's going to be practical for you to do. But there's got to be a good reason why you can't do it. So, for example, if you do have a grade 2 building, there's obviously a process you have to go through to change certain things. So that could be a reason why you don't do certain things in your property. But generally speaking, we recommend people follow the guidance. Keep up to date with changes. So we obviously don't expect you to have your head in codes of practice every evening, because that would just be very boring for everybody. But what we will try to do is we'll keep New Forest Escapes up to date with any significant changes that come out, and then they can obviously let you know as well. So we'll certainly do our best to make sure that we're keeping you well informed. In terms of your maintenance, this is probably more from a cost perspective, but just planning your maintenance throughout the year. So there's obviously peaks and troughs in the year of holiday letting, and each property is kind of its own mini business. So make sure you've got you're ready for your EICR that's due every 5 years. Make sure you're ready for your PAT testing, your fire risk assessments, and that kind of thing, just so that you're not being hit with these surprise costs, because that's just not good for anybody. Keep records. So if you're checking equipment, keep records. Any records that you have are really good to see. Again, just paints the picture of you being a diligent owner, which is really important. Checking your insurance. So again, this is just something that we probably from our experience in holiday letting as well, but insurances can state certain things when it comes to fire safety. You know, I know from a St. Paul's perspective with the cathedral, our insurance company stipulate that we have to approach certain situations in a certain way, and it's the same with holiday letting. Some public liability insurance will insist on having a professional fire risk assessment. Some will insist on having certain types of detection systems in. So it's worth just checking. Most are generally pretty generic, but you can get some that do have specific requests in them. So definitely worth checking your insurance. And then finally, and we are biased, of course, but we'd certainly recommend using an expert for your fire risk assessment. It's a legal requirement from the fire safety order that everybody in a non-domestic property has a fire risk assessment. You can do them yourself. So, you know, if you've got a simple property, there are a number of guides on the internet. There's actually fire risk assessment templates within the guides as well that you can use. But the legislation and guidance can be quite complex, as you've probably established from today's call. So if you're not sure, then do just give us a call. We'd be more than happy to come out and help. Yeah, certainly don't risk it if you're not sure. And I think that's pretty much it. So if Jane, I don't know if you've got any questions. We've put our email address at the bottom there, but of course, we'd certainly recommend going to speak to New Forest Escapes first. But yeah, we're happy to help with any questions that you might have.
Well, I think a few questions are coming in behind the scenes, but just wanted to say, from a New Forest Escapes point of view, yeah, we totally support that last point with Greg and Leo, in that we do ask all of our owners to have professional fire risk assessments. We just think it's such a important area, and it really is, it does require that expertise, because I've tried reading the guidance, and it's, you know, unless you've been doing this a long time like you both have, it's pretty complicated, and it's just about being safe and looking after your guests. So we as a business do make sure that all our owners have a professional one. So yes, don't worry, got you there. So just quickly, if we can unshare your screen, if that's okay, Leo, we will just take you through a little bit more about New Forest Escapes. Can you see my screen? Does that come up?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, yeah, I just wanted to just a couple of minutes just about New Forest Escapes. We are a local business based in Lymington in the New Forest. We make it our mission to be friendly, easily contactable, and it's really important to us to do a good job for our owners and guests. We're also really proud to be a B Corp company, which means we have gone through a process that basically means that our business approach is ethical, and it's about putting people, and that includes our team, our guests, our owners, our planet and profit all at the forefront we do. And that's really important about who we are as a business. I'm just going to go on to our marketing slide, if that's going to go next. Don't know, might not. Hang on a second. Oh, there we are. So that's the team in Milford-on-Sea, having a little quick day out. Obviously, it was in the winter, so it looks quite cold. We're all local, and what's really important about that is we know our area. So we speak to all of our guests, and we know the nuances of the New Forest. So our marketing. So marketing is what we do, and we go above and beyond to stand out in a very busy marketplace. We feature additional content like floor plans, can come in useful, Leo and Greg, for fire escapes and things like that. We have 3D tours, we do drone footage, and where possible, we do all videos of our houses. And that's not just for launching a property, but it's also ongoing. And we visit many properties each year to update this content library because, as you all know out there, it's all about getting in front of the guests continually. This helps our properties shine because we're really well followed on Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, and it's all about driving awareness to our guests and to the website. So what we also know is our houses really well. So each one of our team visits our house, each house. And so when you speak to them on the phone, they know each of those houses uniquely. So revenue management, really key here. Every house is unique and we use dynamic pricing. We do this manually, actually, because we know our properties so well and we know the area. It's not a case of one fits all. So our house captain, Rachel, oversees the pricing on a daily basis, if you can believe it. And her expert knowledge of our market area and that of our team is used to constantly tweak our prices to maximize the return for our owners. We don't do constant discounting like you might see on lots of other bigger websites. That doesn't mean we don't do promotions. It's slightly more discreetly, and we make sure that each house gets its own attention, which is really key. So just a couple of little facts for you. That New Forest Escapes, we over the last year, we had nearly 1 million views on our website. For a small business is pretty high. Last year we spent over 300% more on our marketing and advertising budget. It was a tough year in the industry, and what's important is that we invested in order to drive those bookings for our owners. And what that has meant that in January and February, which are the busier booking months of the year, that actually this year, in the last 2 months, we have seen an increase in 40% in our bookings year on year. So a really good start for 2025. And a couple little other facts that you might want to know is that over 65% of our guests bring dogs with them. So having a pet-friendly home is really important. And up to around 75% of our stays are now short breaks. So that's really important when you're putting together your plan about your New Forest escape, is giving that flexibility to guests, not having the oldest traditional style of Friday to Fridays. We have some really amazing hosts that we're very lucky to work with, and who Leo and Greg have already been around to see a few of them. Even been offered dinner, I heard, Leo, the other day. So that's really nice. So we haven't ever lost a guest, an owner yet, to a competitor. It's because we really care about them. They all know us, they phone us, they come into our office, but also we keep them updated as well. So we're constantly informing them of what's going on in the marketplace and with their house as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but these are all the things that we really focus on with our owners. I'll pick a couple out. Flexible owner use. We're really happy for all of our owners to use their properties as much or little as they want. And I think that's really key. If it's your second home, which most of our owners are having those second homes, is actually they can use it whenever they want. Another thing is we're not a call center. We do know the area, and so we can help people enjoy their stay, which is key for them to coming back to us as well. We've also got in there a little bit different to some of the bigger properties. We always get asked about occupancy. How much is the occupancy in your houses? Actually, we don't focus on that as much. We focus on the revenue over the year. And the reason for that is often we have a lower occupancy than some of the bigger companies, but because of the short breaks and because of how we price, we actually get the same revenue, but for less nights, which means less wear and tear as well. So, oh, this is just a quick one. This starts blowing our trumpet a little bit. We won New Forest Business of the Year at the end of 2024. And again, I think that's just because of what we do and how we care for our owner and guests. So that was just something nice to put in there. Anyway, so hopefully that gives you a good overview of New Forest Escapes. I'm going to just go straight onto the questions and answers. There aren't that many actually, because I think Greg and Leo, you really covered an awful lot of stuff there. What a few of them originally that came through were about the small paying guest guide and the sleeping accommodation guide, but you've explained that with ones for the sort of smaller under 10 sleeps, is that right?
Yeah, so I think it's again it depends on the property and the layout of the property, but generally if it's one of the three criteria, it will move into sleeping accommodation. So if it sleeps over 10, if it's an open plan layout downstairs, or if it's 3 stories or more. So if it's one of those three, it'll fall into sleeping accommodation guide.
And you mentioned also about testing. So we've got a question on that, and regular testing. You said in your presentation monthly, but actually more ideal is with the cleaner. So would you recommend then normally that it's like before every booking, or what would be your recommendation?
I think so. The guidance is really clear in that it does say in between bookings, so in between changeovers, there should be testing of the alarms. It doesn't necessarily say who should do that. So there's a debate, in a lot of agencies and with a lot of holiday owners, like actually who does it? Is it the cleaner? Is it the owner? Could you actually ask the guest to do it? I'm putting things out there, but I think at the very least, if you can demonstrate you've got regular testing, that's better than not doing anything at all. So I think if you can get into a habit of doing it monthly, if it's not possible in between changeovers, then that's certainly a start. But in an ideal world, yeah, when your cleaner's coming in to change over everything, quick test of the alarms, and you can get. I do have. I'm very sad I have it in my house, but you can get these big thumbs on sticks as well. If
Right.
it's a
Literally.
full ceiling, so you can use those if you've got
It's
full.
useful. No, things like that are all useful, aren't they?
They are, but just as well. I mean, just it goes without saying, but just make sure you record it as well. That's just so key. It doesn't take too long, but once you get into a rhythm, it's like anything, isn't it? Once it just becomes a habit, and that's just really important to do, and to make sure you record that as well.
And
And
I'm assuming with that is you wouldn't leave the records on site either. Would you have to record it? Because if you did it in the house, if something happened to the house, it would go up in flames.
Yeah, I probably should have said actually, but we've actually started to add like a logbook template on the back of our reports as well, because again, it's something that we just found that owners didn't have a lot of the time, and you can get testing books off online websites, Amazon, but they're generally aimed at big commercial buildings, and they're quite confusing. So we do make it simple for owners to know what they need to do and
Yeah.
when they need to test. I think my advice would be probably to have it in the property, but
Yeah.
like take an image of it, so that if the worst was to happen and there was a fire in the house and your log sheet burnt, then you'd at least have a record that you were testing. So
Brilliant. Okay. And then I've had another question in about so someone's got a swimming pool in their back garden. It's not fenced, and they've been advised to change to the thumb turns to get out, like you mentioned about not having a key, but they're worried about that. Your sort of take on that particular situation?
I suppose with fire risk, it's one of a number of risks. So whilst Greg and I are very biased, fire risk is the biggest thing in our lives. There are a number of different risks that owners need to try and work with, and that sounds like there's obviously a bit of a health and safety risk there as well as a fire risk. I mean, it depends on the layout of the property, but if you've got sufficient means of escape to the front of the property or the side of the property, it might be that those are the exits that you focus on communicating to your guests, so that if there was a fire alarm, then they would go out of those exits.
Yeah.
But you could have the rear as an emergency exit, as an alternative means of escape if you needed to. Or you could do something with the swimming pool to try and make that area a bit safer. But I would probably focus more on trying to communicate a primary escape route so that guests could safely get out without having that risk of coming across the swimming pool at the back.
Well, it sort of highlights the fact that you really need the experts doing this, don't you? Because like you said, there's lots of different risks, and actually it's you guys highlighting those things and then being able to work with each unique property, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's really difficult. You know, we get sent through quite a lot of questions, you know, by email, and we always try and answer them, but there's always that caveat. It kind of just depends on the property. But another thing I'd suggest with that example would be like emergency lighting, having good lighting around the rear of the property, so that, you know, it just reduces the risk of people not seeing that swimming pool. But yeah, that's a tough one.
And then last one is, do you actually have to put any posters up in the house to show fire exits and signs?
Good question.
Yeah.
Good question. In certainly in most holiday lets, that there won't be a requirement to do so. It's not. It's one of the reasons why it's so important to have the fire safety brief in the welcome folder, because that's your means of communicating. But certainly in the small paying accommodation guide, if your property falls in that guide, there's no requirement for signage in your property. In the sleeping accommodation guide, it just depends on the size of the property. You know, in some really large properties, Greg and I have seen some kind of sleeps 25, sleeps 30 properties. That's when you might get into the territory of needing to have some signage. But in the vast majority of holiday lets, there's no need for that if you have good fire safety brief, good emergency evacuation plan in place.
Well, look, I think that brings us to a close, which is exactly an hour, which is absolutely perfect. So thank you both so much. I've definitely learned a lot already. And what we're going to be doing is putting this on YouTube and also sending it out to all of our owners that have been watching. So everybody will get a copy. So thank you both very much, and good luck with everything else.
Thanks for
Thank you
having
very
us.
much, Jane.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Appreciate it. Bye.